Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kingdom of Valencia and more specifically of its creation, more than else. Kingdom of Valencia, in Valencian Regne de Valencia, in Spanish Reino de Valencia, in Latin Regnum Valencia. Located essentially what is the eastern shore, towards essentially southeastern shore of the Iberian Peninsula, just south fundamentally of Catalonia, and as we will see, becoming part of the Crown of Aragon, not to be confused with the Kingdom of Aragon. I made a video about this last summer or autumn. Essentially, the Aragonese kings had created the sort of confederal power that united various crowns under the control of a single monarch, and that essentially were ruled in a very, that first of all ruled themselves as all medieval powers. Really, there was no such thing like a king owning properly the communities that inhabited its own domains. If anything, he had to swear, as we will see in the same Furo of Valencia in that case, to respect the constitutions, the Furo in fact, so the customs, the laws of the people, right, with some checks and balancement put on the figure of the sovereign himself, that however did have to provide, was to be provided by the communities with the means of ensuring justice, order, etc. And that rose as properly the Crown of Aragon in the late Middle Ages as one of the main powers in Europe, in the Western Mediterranean, and even beyond. Some of you recently said, could you please make a video about Barcelona during, yeah, we can do that. I still have to talk properly about the county of Catalonia, etc. So we'll actually have a lot to catch up with Iberian history that we haven't discussed yet. And as you know, when the Crown of Aragon merged by dynastic union with the Crown of Castile, the Kingdom of Spain was formed. Right, and as a consequence, all the crowns collected by the Aragonese ruler, including the one of Valencia, came to be part of the Spanish monarchy altogether. And you know that it's fundamentally not until the second modern age that the various kingdoms of Spain disappeared. Right, they were united properly in a single state. Still in ancient regime, all these were different countries, right, with different crowns, independently from the whom owned the dynastic sum of them. So as we will see, there is a bit of approximation, but the Kingdom of Valencia was formally created in 1238, when the previous Moorish Taifa of Valencia, as it was called in Arab, was taken in the course of the Reconquista. And in fact, the history of the creation of the kingdom is factually a very typical one of many other Iberian realities. This struggle of reconquest of the Iberian land by the Christians from the Muslims. This would have particular consequences, especially in the Crown of Aragon, because the quick expansion was achieved also essentially integrating the Mudayar, so the Muslim and Jewish majority that inhabited these lands. Right, doesn't matter that these were actually Spanish people that spoke essentially Spanish. I mean, Mozarabic, yes, Arab was the official language, right, of the state, like the Spanish had Latin, right? But that essentially joined initially. I made a video about the Mudayar as properly military units last year that explained this and showed how not you would think that this was more a thing in Castile that after all integrated most of the Andalusia, but actually the majority in relative terms was concentrated in the lands of the Crown of Aragon, Aragon included in a way, but also and especially the Kingdom of Valencia, that were initially granted large autonomies, right, exactly to facilitate the Reconquista. And eventually, towards the late Middle Ages, even in the early modern age, were ever greater repressions that brought eventually also to the forced conversion and or expulsion, right? But as we will see, until the beginning of the 17th century, this very strong Muslim community in the Kingdom of Valencia was an issue, right? Also because at that time the Ottomans threatened the Spanish coast and so on, so these people hoped that those would come to essentially to invade. In any case, the Kingdom of Valencia was dissolved for other crowns, components of the Crown of Aragon, by Philip V of Bourbon in 1707 by the means of the Nueva Planta decrees, right? And this was a result of the War of Spanish Succession, but maybe we can talk about it at some point. So, as the Kingdom of Valencia was created as a Christian power, it was ruled by laws and institutions stated in the charters of Valencia, pronunciation, that were promulgated by the first king, in fact, James I of Aragon, also known as James the Conqueror, that really spent, in fact, a dramatic amount of time of his life and took a great pride from his accomplishments, especially in the Kingdom of Valencia, who, in fact, in 1261 created issued the furo in the newly created Valencian Parliament, and then he took that oath, right, sworn on the force for his office of monarch of Valencia before the local parliament. And this act granted naturally wide self-government. It was typical, in fact, under the Crown of Aragon general, at least by the degree it was, because otherwise was the normality even in the rest of Spain, in other countries. And that characterizes a bit, again, the confederal nature of the Crown of Aragon. This rule over very different lands. And at this point, James was also conquering other lands, and it's very interesting that he left some of the most important medieval chronicles, by the way, in a very direct, almost close to properly spoken language, in a narrative fashion, to describe his exploit, the ones of his parents. His father was killed at Muret, for example, by the forces of Montfort during the Albigensian Crusade, but even some of other ancestors. And he took, again, great pride of the conquest of Valencia that took, not even that long of a time. I mean, he was eventually completed by his successor James II in another time, even if it was the same century basically, but still times were speeding up fastly, and in terms of development and changes, etc. James II, who was also not just the son of King of Aragon, but also the daughter of King Manfred of Hohenstaufen of Sicily, and so that it's also interesting because we were talking about it recently. So the actual conquest of what would later become the Kingdom of Valencia, territorially speaking, happened before 1238, which is the date in which the city of Valencia was taken. But it started, in fact, in 1230. The conquest started in 1232, when the king of the Crown of Aragon, James I, called sorry for the pronunciation, if I'm butchering, the first, primero, I guess, El Conqueridor, so the conqueror, took Murcia, an ancient walled city located quite characteristically on a hilltop, right? The Iberian Peninsula being, as you know, terrifying ground, which is dotted by all these fortresses, and you have literally to stop at every one of them to besiege them, because there's practically no other way to move on strategically. And that's what, in fact, most of the Reconquista was really about, aside from the most clamorous pitched clashes. But this is true mostly for the entire Middle Ages. James I just was very patient and methodic in this, and he used some kind of psychological warfare in a positive sense, because, as we were saying before, he would grant the local Muslim inhabitants all the time to, for example, if they wanted to go away, when they surrendered, they could roam the citadels for 5 days, and before the Christians moved in, or they could simply leave with important autonomies under Christian control. Naturally, at the other extreme, these situations were one of the most horrifyingly violent that you can imagine, even dream to imagine. Hopefully not, for your for your mental sanity. But still, this was normality as well, depending on the political strategic contingencies. The year after, 1233, also the towns of Borriana and Peniscola were taken from the Valencia, so the Valencia Taifa. At this point, let's remember the Muslims of Al-Andalus had already fragmented from a couple of centuries on, are irreversible in spite of the waves of conquerors from the Atlas, from North Africa. In this, basically mirroring the same feudal fashion was present also in Christendom, right? That this happened in general to the Islamic world after the 10th, 11th century, that it follows similar patterns to the same one of the West. The same can be said for the Byzantines and so on. And they were suffering a broader moment of crisis. This naturally had stemmed from the collapse of the older caliphate that had essentially attempted to maintain as all early Islamic powers, this centralized kind of bureaucratic and also militarily professional permanent system of Roman origin in the rich Andalusia, etc. But this thing had, however, its own limits as well. It was a very expensive system, so it fragmented down, and so it was just step by step, also from the other side, that the Christians reconquered these lands. Very often also in a very confused situation, as we will see now, especially as far as the share between the various Christian powers was concerned, because they somewhat competed with each other. And after Las Navas, especially, that had already happened in 1212, opening the way to southern Andalusia, most of these territories were free to take, in a sense, right? And nor the kings of Castilla and Aragon, the largest powers in Spain, could factually control it at the beginning, right? They tried to make it quick, but this also created some issues between one another, trying to counter each other's expansion. And other errant knights would just settle around. We've seen it also in the video about medieval Portugal, that at some point it was very complicated just to own control. There were knights coming from the rest of Europe that simply, took a citadel from the local Muslims with their own private forces, and then at some point the king of one of these Iberian monarchies came to knock at the door and say, well, I will recognize you this fief as long as you become my vassal, and that was made. But originally was like, this is truly the far west of Europe, quite literally meant, and also in analogy with what happened in the New World, right? So, and I think that even in this sense, the Reconquista has nothing to do with the way, for example, the Spanish treated eventually the Native Americans, because they were habituated to that kind of idea, right? To that kind of almost, in fact, explorational and mono-oriented kind of view of struggle and of fate and conversion and adaptation of the local reality to their own one. So 1238 again is the moment in which James I enters Valencia, exactly on October the 9th. This is considered the foundation of the kingdom, because Valencia, yes, was objectively the most important center and became an important base of operations and so on. There was another phase lasting 2 years between 1243 and 1245, because these, of course, Aragon had other problems in the meanwhile, so everything was done gradually. There was also to consolidate the new conquest, fortification, dealing with local communities, and so on. And at the end of this expansion, James I basically arrived to the boundaries that had been agreed between Aragon and Castile, with some set of treaties that had occurred in the previous years. This limits, at this point, Castile was already by far the largest power in Spain, right? So especially with the rise to the throne of Alfonso X in 1252, is one of the great figures of the time, right? He was also king of Germany at some point. He was considered, he was even descendant of the Hohenstaufen, so it was the peak of universalism and this idea of imperial power and grandeur that Castile could objectively claim in Spain as the largest power, and properly a kind of multicultural one, because the Castilians had styled themselves as soon as they had conquered Toledo back in the day as protectors of the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, to stress, of course, how large that the latter minorities that were in most of these lands, actually majorities, actually were. So very complex view. We will have to talk about it again soon. But it was, as we were saying before, it was evident as these powers were swarming in Muslim territory that it was complicated to define also the boundaries between each other. There had been the Treaty of Al-Mitzara. Was actually the third of a series of 3 between the Crown of Aragon and the one of Castile, determining essentially the limits of their expansion in Andalusia. And very often considered that it was not like even a direct occupation. There were, for example, still Muslim vassals of Christian kings that, in this sense, could also be raided on, as everything was decentralized normally, and like the idea of affirming your own power passed also through the way you could actually launch this offensive on some kind of disobedient vassals. In this sense, since they were heathens, you could also do it with freer hand. And this treatise had established the respective desired heirs of influence of the two kingdoms. And the Treaty of Al-Mitzara established in particular the south line of Aragonese expansion in the line formed by the essentially this towns of Biar and Busot and other lands that are located today in the north of the province of Alicante. And south of this line, everything was considered to be part of the Castilian area. This importantly included the Kingdom of Murcia. That was another reino, properly defined by these, as they were all previous taifas, right? So they had had a previous political administrative unit, and they were, there was an important deal of continuity also with Muslim rule in that sense. And as we were saying before, there was a competition between these two states. It was not just military, but it was about effectively winning over the locals, because that's actually the only thing that government means. You can't control anything if you don't have the decisive moral support of the local population. So the Mudéjar, mostly say just Muslims, were also lots of Jews, and especially in this area, historically, on the coasts, with the rich cities and so on. Considered that the this were the most important. This was the most important aim, right? Castilla was more of a, as you know, kind of continental power, even though they had access to the sea, but not really. I made a video about the Castilian Navy back in the day, between the 14th and 15th century, explaining a little bit how they also, around this time when they conquered Seville, that was a major port, and made it through the Genoese also, properly seat of a, and later on, or even probably of a small Castilian, probably national fleet on the Atlantic. The Mediterranean was historically, so the areas controlled by the Crown of Aragon was instead much more maritime oriented. Just think about the aforementioned Barcelona, that de facto became the capital of the crown, and these other towns that had been historically just, say, open to the Mediterranean trade. It also, Aragon would grow increasingly because initially the Reconquista, even of these coasts, was carried out with the help of the Genoese and the Pisan fleets. But later on, Aragon would become, in the late Middle Ages, a maritime power in its own regard, and a hell of one, frankly, capable of competing even with Italian rivals. And so there was an important, let's say, Castile wanted, in theory, to, and would reach the Mediterranean as well in the southeast, right? And that's why that boundary was important, because if Aragon would have just followed the coast, probably would have beaten the Castilian on the longer run. But since on the continental side Castile was stronger, and there were often quarrels and engagements in the Castilian Aragonese frontier, and Aragon was the weaker power, that this had come to be a negotiation. But what about the local communities, right? The rich ones of the coast especially were also difficult to, once you took the city and you could replenish, you supply it by sea, it was difficult even to besiege it. And those were the strategic areas that the the Aragonese kings were also to garrison better, and they would prefer to give the poor hinterland and in the mountains, etc., that also basically are the quite inhospitable areas at some levels, to the nobility, to prevent their control of these rich centers. And so an important part of this competition passed through the Mudéjar policy, and so how much autonomy you wanted to give to these people in terms of their faith and their customs and ultimately self-determination, to beat the other Christian competitor in the race for the peninsula. So much that, as we know, even later on, even after Las Navas, it's the Emirate of Granada, properly the Nasrids, would remain there for almost other 3 centuries, not because the Spanish didn't lack the means to take them out. The Campaign of Granada in 1492 was a hell of one. We can make a video about that, but let's say it's mostly because the Iberian powers began to fight each other that the Moors lasted for so long, still on the Iberian soil. But it was because, in fact, the majority of Andalusia was Muslim and would remain so also under Christian rule. There is no need to digress on how many, even Ferdinand of Aragon had, if I'm not wrong, his mother was Jewish. There was a lot of hypocrisy around this. The confessor of Isabel of Castile was a cardinal. He was also probably Jewish, or I don't remember, Muslim, I don't remember initially. But we're talking, this level of commixtion, for which was kind of also very, everything very blurred, and very conveniently so from a political point of view, playing this. The final expulsion en masse of the Mudéjar occurred only in 1609. This is what I mean. And up to that point, they had this population remained still a problem in a sense, because of course the power was Christian. So how do you cope with that at the end of the day? This is important because it's well after the edict on the limpieza de sangre and the expulsions of 1492, and so that tells you how you couldn't properly dislodge them because there were so many, and the states at that time didn't have properly the power nor the interest of leaving them. I mean, think about all the Jews that were expelled from Spain. They went to other places in Europe. They were often, very, entrepreneurial and kind of educated people. Spain lost a lot of assets because of that. It's even maybe also its later stagnations, also in part due to this, but it's not different from other such minorities and historically. Think about the Huguenots in France or the time of Louis XIV and so on. In any case, the need of homogenization was equally important from a cultural point of view, and a bit if not the ideology of the Reconquista that, as we were exemplifying before, was a bit mixed with the idea of multicultural coexistence, still a broader driving factor, the one of conversion or properly reconquest, in fact, from Muslim control. And initially there were lots of pacts, advantageous pacts with the local Muslim population. For example, there is a very famous figure that is Abu Abd Allah Muhammad ibn Udail al-Sagir, popularly known as Al-Azraq, who was an Arab Moorish commander. I think his mother was Christian, of Andalusia, and he came, if I'm not wrong, properly from the king, the former Taifa of Valencia, and a vassal later on of the Kingdom of Valencia, that however organized a series of rebellions against James I, who however kind of estimated him and also saved his life at some point, because he could it would be on no use because he was eventually killed anyway, but not by him, right? Because there was a sentiment of respect, and aside from that, also a quite pragmatic view of the fact that if there was a leader, this leader could be co-opted, and so those who were under him could be brought down more easily than fragmenting them further into many other heads and guerrilla chieftains and so on. And Al-Azraq's rebellions were actually quite disruptive as well. They occurred in 1244, 1248, 1276. And during the first of this, he briefly regained Islamic independence for the lands south of the Yukar, pronounced correctly, I hope, river. But he was forced to surrender soon after. In the second revolt, King James I was almost killed in battle because of him, but Al-Azraq was also finally subjugated. And during, and again, he was forgiven just because it was fundamentally friendly, say, bond with James I. Under the third rebellion, Al-Azraq was killed, right? But this wouldn't end rebellions that actually continued also under his son, by the way. So this was all possible because, again, of this important element that had to be accepted in the game to beat Castile, but also would naturally bring to these problems locally the same way. James II of Aragon, known as the Just Jaume the Secundo, El Just, he was the grandson of James I. Well, he initiated a further wave of expansion towards the south in 1296, and this, as we were saying before, however, infringed the previous pact with Castile, the one that had established the Biar-Busot line. So he factually expanded in what was the kingdom of Murcia. That was quite fertile, especially around the city that had grown for that reason. So it began curtailing it in a way, and also in the broader area of the Vega Baia del Segura, so this province of Alicante, where the local Muslim rulers were already bound by pacts with Castile and governing essentially by proxy on behalf of the Castilian kings. And as we were saying before, the Castilians weren't even particularly gentle with them. They raided periodically in order to affirm their sovereignty on the land, but this naturally also would create, was first of all meant that there was no way to control them otherwise, or at least that Castile was involved in other matters that had decided that this was not a priority. But this naturally would, by some degree, bring the same Muslims to partly side with Aragon. At this point, Aragon was very powerful. The Aragonese, even though the crown was never it was probably a sum of kingdoms at this point. The Aragonese had controlled Sicily, expanded their influence over Sardinia. So the crown of Aragon was very powerful, but at the same time, all these lands ruled traditionally in an autonomous way. The power of the crown was still considerable, however, and rising dramatically also for Castile to worry about this. And consider the typical warfare of the Reconquista frontier. We talked about it very often, was pretty much based on hit and run strategy and tactics, skirmishes, raids, right? It was complicated to outstretch supply lines, for example, for carrying out a siege in such, as we've seen, turbulent territory, where also most of the people were also disloyal, potentially. But the Aragonese were successful in this, and James II extended the limits of what was effectively the Kingdom of Valencia, right? He did it on the base of that administrative district, let's say, of the kingdom. South, the Aragonese troops took Orihuela and the same Murcia. So actually a very important feat. And again, the most important centers were the ones on the coast. Largely the hinterland was more complicated to control, but still it was needed to prevent that same infiltration could come to raid over the surrounding countryside from the mountains. Then that's the typical thing strategically, that you don't even really need a large power to do that. If you retreat in the mountains, carry out guerrilla warfare. Yes, the greatest power is in the lowlands, which controls the city and is the strongest, but still there is always this thorn in the side that can be very disruptive in such a politically delicate area, by the way. So the Castilians and the Aragonese decided to, however, put an end to this composition and on that frontier, at least. And there were two agreements. First one was the Sentencia Arbitral de Torres in 1304. That was, however, amended the year after by the Treaty of Elche, I don't know how to pronounce, which assigned Orihuela and also Alicante and Elche to the Kingdom of Valencia. So we're actually recognizing the fait accompli of the Aragonese conquest. While Murcia, that was more important, however, was ceded by the Aragonese to Castile, to the crown of Castile. So this would finally settle the matter between the two crowns, and defining what would remain essentially the modern boundaries too of the Kingdom of Valencia. And in the process, as well, as much as 4 Muslim taifas had been conquered: the one of Valencia, Alpuente, Denia, and Murcia. And the whole, like, let's say, the bulk of this conquest, as we've seen, took place in the first half of the 13th century. It lasted, in fact, less than 50 years, which, considering the rhythms of the Reconquista, and especially at least the ones in such a more compressed land between the sea and the mountains, was not that short in time. Was carried out very methodically, very patiently, as we were saying before, mostly siege warfare, fortress after fortress. There was no need to risk everything in a pitched battle most of this time. So because, say, it was not much of a matter of choice, but simply the taifas were too weak and quarreling with each other to put up a major force that could even just pose the threat on the field of battle to a large Aragonese army. Or even if this could happen in some cases, the Aragonese had the upper hand most of the time, and their advantage politically and strategically. It's exact, and altogether the world conquest, and so practically the creation of the Kingdom of Valencia, took less than 1 century. As we've seen with the large concessions given to the Muslim population, to the Mudayar. So another point why these communities had been integrated so quickly was the fact that the taifas once were not so stratified like the one of Christendom, right? The Muslims had never fully developed at least the same amount of feudalism existed in Western Europe, Castile especially, but also the interland of the Crown of Aragon was mostly typical of the European situation of the time. There is, lots of serfs and fundamentally the noblemen ruling on the peasantry, kind of as seeing this as a prerogative of their own. That's why, before I was saying, it was also complicated for these powers to control effectively. After the Moorish army was crushed at Las Navas, the independent knights would settle and take autonomously and take that as an earned right. Negotiating the conquest of the Mudayar communities meant to essentially prevent the nobility. Right, this was done by the king, so it was meant to prevent the nobility to settle there and taking over. That's why these people had to be strong, even properly from a military point of view. And again, in that video I made on the Mudayar, we talked about this. Even in size, they contributed importantly to the infantry, but also to cavalry at some point. So they were also an interesting urban development and not something very different from other areas of southern Europe. So the militias, were important, aside to next to the feudal contingents, to which, however, were subordinated, given that the same Christian kings operated with them and with the nobility. But still, they were important and solid, and had to remain like that if they wanted to counter the nobility, because in this way the kings could say, there are these communities, we are their protectors, and nobody can really touch them without going against me, right? There was still, in theory, a broader threat that could be posed by North African powers, attempts of, reinvasion of the Iberian Peninsula. It happened at different times. I made videos about this, the Battle of Rio Salado and others, So this was, say, the possibility that, as we've seen, lasted even up to Ottoman times, that the Christian rulers had to envisage in that situation. Consider that these conquests were all crusades anyhow, right? Pope Gregory IX recognized properly the crusade of James I, also known to be a devout king, right? So it was just done by the book within the rules. After all, again, as a Spanish monarch, yes, as every medieval monarch, everything was complicated, but as far as the main objective was concerned, reconquer the Muslim-held lands. That's basically the thing that when you don't know what to do, you just can't do without any problem, without any explanation, say, needed. So it was an important gluing factor, because there was also an important migration, by the way, of Christian settlers, especially from Aragon, into these newly conquered territories. That was yet another way to counterbalance the local political situation in favor of the Christians, but without giving too much power to noblemen. This was a tumultuous age of expansion. The 13th century bit the peak, as we know, medieval civilization. There were naturally lands that were granted to the nobility, right? Where the so-called leys, the repartiments, would, I presume it would translate like laws or repartition, that still entailed, of course, the still largely feudal system that these monarchies had, for which, of course, the nobility received large amounts of land. They were needed to have that important bulk of professional forces that were also so effective against the Muslim armies on the long run. So the just as we've seen before, the king would retain for himself the more densely populated lands in the coastal plains that were also growing of an important middle class, with Mediterranean trade, the connection with the Catalonian markets that were extremely florid, and also granting the force of these cities royal charters regulating civil law and administration locally, so that they could always be accountable to the king, and vice versa. Whereas the nobility in general was given in this Kingdom of Valencia the lands of the interior that were mostly mountainous and sparsely populated, right? So some kind of military colonies, rather. And still, there was someone who would go there just for acquiring new land. In absolute terms, it was not just a few for those times. There are some issues on, what kind of linguistic evolutional pattern this conquest took at a local level, because it's said that fundamentally in the hinterland it was mostly the Aragonese language among the Western Romance ones that spread, because of also these settlers from the north, from a more kind of pastoral reality. Aragon being more similar to Castile than to Catalonia. And conversely, in fact, the Catalan language spreading along the coasts, right? So it's an Occitan or Romance language that in fact was spoken from the Muslim border to the Alps, and along the southwestern European coast. And there is some debate on, in fact, modern Valencian would be considered a variant of Catalan, right? So that tells you how important it was. Of course, because of the exchanges along the coast, etc., were quite important since ever, frankly. And there's probably a geographic boundary as well, a sort of cradle, sheltered by the mountains, separates them from the hinterland. There is the question of Mozarabic as well, because naturally Mozarabic was still a Romance language. So yes, all those people were mostly Muslims, but they were Spanish people, they spoke Spanish, and so not much differently from the Christian. So there is a debate, as far as I know, going on, because there is a very few trace of how much Mozarabic influenced the eventually the local dialect. Probably much, but it probably wasn't that different, right? But I'm not aware of studies about this. In any case, the Kingdom of Valencia expanded dramatically, especially in the later Middle Ages, mostly from an economical point of view. And the Crown of Aragon at this time began to be really ever more powerful, especially after the conquest of Naples. And so it secured a stronger position in the Mediterranean mostly from Barcelona, and so Valencia would be attracted gravitationally. And this is why in the city that you still can visit, it's basically the most famous attraction, historically speaking. There is the Taula de Cambi, or also Taula de Cambi, simply known as Taula. It would be essentially a municipal public bank that existed in Barcelona, in other places. The building of Valencia was served essentially a stock exchange market, right, of some products. The name is properly Silk Exchange, the name of the building. So in Valencian it would be Lonia de la Seda, or Liotia de la Seda, and within there were other exchange markets, were factually other councils, right, for different types of business were called as also the name of other products. For example, the oil exchange, the Lota de Loli, and that didn't have to do just with agricultural oils, however, were quite important for the local economy. For any kind of business, it had naturally a political weight. It was essentially a council as well, with some representatives, etc. And today's building is famous mostly because of its Gothic architecture that was actually modeled, in the case of the Taula of the Silk Exchange of Valencia, from a pre-existing one in, I think, in Mallorca and the Balearic Islands, and witnessing also just the prosperity of the area. It's a magnificent Gothic, say, internal architecture that took only 15 years to be built. And Valencia, for this trade prosperity, was also one to adopt some important technologies. For example, some of the earliest of using the movable type system of technology of printing that was designed at the time by Johannes Gutenberg. And there were also some important authors, artistic activity. For example, aside from the aforementioned architects, Leonot Martorell was a Valencian knight and writer, best known for authoring novel Tirant Le Blanche, written in Valencian language and published in Valencia, in fact, in 1490. It's considered one of the peaks of literature in Catalan language, right? Also, Ausiàs March was a Valencian poet and knight of from Gandia in the Kingdom of Valencia. That also is considered as an important exponent, member of the golden center of Catalan Valencian literature at this time. So I think this is all as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. Naturally, we will talk in a way or another about Valencian history on some other occasion, more in depth. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.